In 2022, Counterweight, the organization that Helen Pluckrose founded and that was absorbed into the Institute for Liberal Values, had a virtual conference on liberal approaches to diversity and inclusion. Starting in 2025, we will be rolling out one talk a month that was presented at the conference. We sit down with the original presenters throughout 2025 to see what has changed since 2022. With diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives seemingly on the chopping block, we are curious to hear what our original participants are witnessing and experiencing on the ground. Is DEI really dead or just in remission? Are there healthy alternatives to DEI that we should consider? Or do we throw the baby out with the bathwater and wipe our hands clean? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. This month, we share Angel Eduardo's original presentation to the conference. You can find our podcast where we check in with him in the present day to find out how things have changed, entitled Don't Buy Lemons, in the show notes. Angel Eduardo, welcome to the Counterweight Conference on Liberal Approaches to Diversity and Inclusion. I've gotten the opportunity to introduce you at several events, and I love doing so. So you're one of my favorite people to introduce. Angel, you are an artist, you're a photographer, you're a musician. You are now the director of messaging and editorial at the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And I love to say this, but you are also, in my mind, the king of all-star manning, which is lovely. And I just love the work you do. I'm looking forward to hearing from you your ideas on liberal approaches to diversity and inclusion, as I know that you have dedicated a lot of your life in having these conversations and learning how to be in difficult conversations so we can starman each other and cross these divisions that we see coming up, particularly in the area of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jen, for having me. It's awesome to be here. I have a lot to say on this topic, but I like to start by just asking the question for those of you who are watching. When you look at me, what do you see? Or rather, who do you see? You can obviously tell a few things about me right away. I have long curly hair and a fro. I have some grays in my beard. I'm a man. I speak English. I have a great tan. But apart from these obvious and superficial details, what does my appearance tell you about me? Nothing. Now, what if I told you that I'm first generation Dominican American, that I live in New York City, that my parents immigrated here from the Dominican Republic in the 1980s? What do you know about me then? Next to nothing. In fact, you may even know even less than you did a moment ago, because you now have to grapple with and combat all these stereotypes and assumptions that inevitably flood your mind when you hear words like Dominican, immigrant, and New York City. Stereotypes and assumptions that are influenced by your own backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. Maybe you think I love baseball and basketball, or that I'm into hip-hop music, or that my family and I struggled through poverty. You'd be wrong about all of those things, and your assumptions about me based on these superficial characteristics are the reason why. I may as well have told you my horoscope. If you rejected these assumptions, or if they didn't even occur to you, good for you. But you're still back at square one. Who am I? You simply don't know. But if I told you that I'm a writer and a musician, as Jen mentioned, or that my favorite movie is Pulp Fiction, or that my favorite song is Bohemian Rhapsody, or that I've been obsessed with Superman since I was 3 years old, then you'd start to see something interesting, something unique, something fascinating, an individual. You'd start to see me. A while ago, I saw the following question making the rounds on my Twitter feed. When was the first time you saw yourself represented in media? I immediately jumped to characters I grew up loving, like Superman, or Raphael from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Calvin from the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. But many of the responses I was seeing were a little different. I noticed that people who self-identified as quote-unquote black shared only images of quote-unquote black characters. People of Asian descent shared only images of characters from Asian backgrounds. People with red hair shared only images of redheads. Tall people shared only images of tall characters. Short people, short characters, and so on and so on. What I realized was that I was instinctively engaging with the concept of representation in a fundamentally different way. None of the characters I had thought of looked anything like me, and it hadn't even occurred to me that they should. For many others, though, that seemed to be not just the primary criterion, but the only one. And all I could think was, how limiting. This perspective is rooted in what I consider to be the fundamental flaw in much of today's anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. These programs and initiatives are, for good reason, trying to correct a historical flattening and reduction of the myriad traits, qualities, and experiences that make us human beings, and the division, hatred, and dehumanization that went along with those things. I'm enthusiastically in favor of that project. The problem is, for many of these programs and initiatives, their way of correcting those horrible historical and present realities is by repeating them, whether it's intentional or not. So let's explore this idea of representation. Imagine there's a new Netflix series starring a male, first-generation Dominican American who lives in New York City. Demographic markers that just so happen to match mine exactly. Am I represented in media now? What if I watch the show and discover that this character is a total asshole? What if he enjoys completely different music than me? What if he dresses in a different style? What if he has different family dynamics? What if every piece of who he is and who I am is a mismatch, except for those superficial details that we've decided are the most important? Am I still represented? Must I see myself in this character despite our actually being nothing alike? When we engage in representation this way, we weaken its meaning and its true purpose. We make a mockery of the deep human connections that art and media allow us to cultivate across time, culture, borders, and even identity groups that we divide ourselves into. Taking this surface level approach to representation forces us to continue glorifying details about us that are, at best, as informative about our true selves as our high school transcripts or our seasonal allergies. At worst, it causes us to reify concepts such as race that we should be working to leave behind completely. Taking this tack also inevitably raises the question, who gets to count as a representative and who gets to decide? This should be impossible to answer, but our stubborn insistence on answering it anyway is where we veer into essentialism and, by extension, tokenism. It can also quickly lead to exploitation and erasure. Consciously or not, we reject true representation entirely with many of our ham-handed attempts to foster it. We say we want representation, but what we get instead are avatars and caricatures. We behave as though all people from a particular identity group share a single experience, and that no one else can even have or understand that experience. As we try to increase diversity and representation in media and elsewhere, we end up flattening a wide range of humanity into a single narrative. We trap ourselves in it, we echo it in real life, and then rage against attempts by others to complicate or deconstruct it. Sound familiar? This is one of the reasons why the character of Will Smith on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, for example, is considered to be authentically Black, while his cousin Carlton Banks is seen as his shameful opposite. We hang onto this falsehood so tightly that we invent terms like multiracial whiteness and apply what I call the one thought rule to anyone who doesn't fit our preconceived notions of what members of a group should think, say, feel, or be. Rather than having art and media expand our horizons, we use it to gatekeep, essentialize, and pressure others into conformity. If the goal of representation is to correct historical wrongs, it doesn't help us to inadvertently echo them. If our goal is to broaden the kinds of stories we get to tell and the kinds of characters we get to see on screen, on stage, and on paper, much of our current approach is like quenching our thirst with salt water. When we engage the difficult topics of racism, intolerance, bigotry, and exclusion with this framework, we are bound to fail because racism, intolerance, bigotry, and exclusion are built into it. We call these programs diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the reality ends up being something else entirely. Here's another story. Years ago, at an old job, I watched as the office assistant delivered a box to the wrong person. There was a brief, awkward exchange before it dawned on him. There were two short, slender Korean women with long black hair and glasses in our office, and he had confused one for the other. He instantly turned lobster red, began apologizing, and the awkwardness just filled the room. We all cringed as he shuffled out with the box in his hand, his head bowed in shame. How should we understand this incident? How should it be handled? According to a diversity, equity, and inclusion training that I would take years later for a different job, what I had witnessed then was a racial microaggression. See, the office assistant was what we in our race obsessed world would call a quote unquote white man. And because the Korean woman was a quote unquote person of color, this incident was no mere mistake. It was evidence of the office assistant's deep seated racism, and the proper response to it was censure and scorn. During that DEI seminar that I took, we covered many of the things that I expected: implicit bias, privilege, and offensive language and humor. I had plenty of thoughts about the ways that these topics were discussed, but generally, it struck me as reasonable and understandable, particularly in the context of a workplace. We all have blind spots and biases. It wasn't until my first office job that I realized I had spent much of my life in a bubble. All of my friends were artists and creatives, and we had grown up with an extremely unfiltered way of being, thinking, and speaking. As a result, my language and humor were freewheeling in a way that I didn't realize was beyond the pale for many people in my office. Because of this, I spent a lot of time speaking to the head of HR. It hadn't occurred to me then that the world I occupied wasn't just shared by everyone. It was a good lesson, and I appreciated the grace with which my errors were pointed out. My trouble with the DEI training that I took came when we discussed microaggressions. These are typically defined as the everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, and insults that people of color, women, LGBT populations, or those who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions. It's a mouthful. It's a lot. And it was something that our trainer took a great deal of time to address. They used the analogy of mosquito bites to illustrate the way the effects of microaggressions compound over time. One bite is no big deal. But when you're constantly being bitten by mosquitoes all day long, and when it seems like they're biting you specifically, the pain and irritation from those bites are going to add up. Eventually, you're going to reach a breaking point, which might cause you to lash out. That last mosquito may not have meant you harm. Maybe none of them did. But it's not about what they meant. And it's not just about that one bite. It's about the cumulative toll of all of them. Now, I found this to be a very apt analogy. We've all been in similar positions where our patience is depleted and we find ourselves exploding on somebody who may have had very little or nothing to do with why we're actually upset. It's a human thing to lose one's temper, to misinterpret a joke or a comment, or to respond harshly, or take our bad day out on someone without realizing that's what we've done. It's also just as human to be on the receiving end of these outbursts and to feel mistreated and unfairly maligned as a result. Maybe by employing more compassion and understanding, I thought, we can learn to navigate these issues together. But our trainer didn't take the analogy to that conclusion. Instead, they just left it at the explanation for lashing out. They stopped there. This, in effect, renders it a justification, not just for overreacting to minor infractions, but also for punishing one person for the infractions of others, or the perceived infractions of others. Just think about the implications there. So let's say I, a quote-unquote person of color, experience microaggressions from 20 quote-unquote white people. Let's ignore, for now, the obvious role that subjectivity plays, right? For the first 19 instances, I keep quiet and I brush them off despite my hurt feelings. I keep it all inside. But the 20th is my breaking point. According to our trainer, it is now not only understandable, but justified for me to blow up on this person, number 20, taking all my frustration out on them, despite their individual offense being small and probably unintended. Holding an individual responsible for the perceived behaviors or traits of the group they belong to. What does that sound like? I wondered that to myself during our training, but I didn't say anything. I kept quiet. Later in the day, we were given worksheets, each of them describing a different scenario involving microaggressions, bias, or flat-out bigotry. Our job was to take 5 minutes, come up with the best approach to handling the scenario, and report back. As it happens, my worksheet described a racialized white man who habitually confuses the names of two racialized black women in the office. The responses from my coworkers were exactly what you would expect. This white guy needed to be sat down and chastised for his racism. He needed to be alerted to his privilege, and he needed to atone for his error. He should take a DEI training, like the one that we were all participating in. In fact, his company should mandate it. But I remembered the incident that I had witnessed at an old job, and I raised my hand. I started telling everyone the story of the office assistant, and I heard gasps and groans when I described the mistake that he had made. The thing is, I said, I know why that had probably happened, and it wasn't racism. I explained that this guy had only recently started working at that office, and he delivered mail to the entire building, something like 150 people. I realized that he never really had time to speak with or get to know anybody beyond a few quick greetings as he popped in and out of room after room after room on 2 different floors. If he had learned more about that Korean woman than her superficial characteristics, her glasses, dark long hair, her height, the fact that she was Korean, if he had known her hobbies and interests, for example, he probably wouldn't have confused her with the other Korean woman, who likely had completely different hobbies and interests. If he had known either of them as people, no amount of physical similarity would have led to confusion. Just think about twins. Parents can tell twins apart, even though they're identical. Why? Because they know their children. It's the same sort of thing. So I said, if I were in charge, I would recognize this not really as racism, but as a lack of company cohesion. And I proposed a solution. I said I would institute a set of meet and greets for the entire staff as part of the onboarding process. So anytime somebody else was hired, they would have meetings with everybody just to have a quick chat, get to know a little bit about these people, right? This would help coworkers and new employees get to know one another more deeply, even if they didn't get to see each other all the time. And I'm certain that once they know each other better, that kind of situation, that kind of mix-up would hardly ever happen again. Now, the response from the trainer and everyone else after I said all this was bizarre. It wasn't that they disagreed or thought my suggestion was a bad idea, although I'm sure some did. It's that nothing remotely like it had even occurred to them. All their responses were the same. Mine was the only one that was different. Given the framework that they were in and the lens with which they'd spent the entire day being trained to see through, what I had called for wasn't even in the realm of possibility. Everyone went straight to racism as the explanation for the office assistant's behavior, and they jumped right to opprobrium as the proper intervention. They had responded to someone being reduced to assumptions, stereotypes, and superficial characteristics by doing the exact same thing to somebody else. And the problem is that this was by design, though not maliciously so. I actually found our trainer to be very amiable, and I took a liking to them right away. I could tell that they didn't see this as some cynical money grab, the way that you hear many others describe DEI programs and bias trainings. The sincerity was palpable in this person, and I couldn't detect even a shred of self-righteousness or judgment. Despite my disagreements with the things that we did and discussed that day, I was heartened by that sincerity. The issue wasn't them or their intentions. It was that the framework they were using primed us to emphasize division and cultivate discord. It was a foregone conclusion for everyone around me that something horrible had happened in that exchange with the office assistant. As they say, the question is not whether racism occurred, but how it had occurred. And this throws so many other possibilities and potential solutions out the window. It goes beyond someone with a hammer always finding a nail. It's like someone with a hammer owning a nail factory. How can that approach solve any of the problems we so desperately want to solve? It can't. At best, it will be ineffectual. At worst, it will foment racism and intolerance where none existed. But thankfully, these divisive strategies are not our only options. There are ways to counteract bias, bigotry, and belligerence in a way that doesn't inadvertently reflect, exacerbate, and perpetuate those things. For example, it's by having a little bit of patience and grace for where people are coming from. Keeping yourself aware of the fact that we're all products of our environments, our upbringings, our educations, and experiences. There, but for the grace of circumstance, go we. The HR people at my old job had grace with me when I was making inappropriate jokes in the office. I thought they were funny. I think they're still funny, but I get it. I appreciated that grace. I learned from it. It helped me become a more self-aware person. I had to understand other people were in a different spot. Another way of doing it is by granting the same forgiveness and compassion that we would appreciate when we slip up and lose our cool, which is an inevitability. The recognition that we're all human and as a result inescapably flawed is a unifying fact, not a divisive one. We all make mistakes. We all put our feet in our mouths from time to time. We all misunderstand, mischaracterize, and misinterpret things when we're feeling tired, insecure, stressed, or scared. Rather than take those moments to point fingers and assign self-righteous blame, it can be an opportunity for collaboration and cohesion. We can help one another get better together. Another way is by emphasizing our unique individuality, the way I did when I slowly revealed specific details about myself to you earlier on. In those moments, I inevitably began coming into sharper focus for you. It became so much harder for you to dissolve me into a racial, ethnic, or social grouping. You really started to see me, to distinguish me from the probably millions of other first-generation Dominican American men in New York City. That's the antidote. That's the foundation upon which anti-racist activism and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs should be built. A major issue with our discourse surrounding identity is that we fail to either zoom in close enough or zoom out far enough. We spend too much of our time in this low-resolution middle where everything is fuzzy and out of focus. We prioritize that fuzziness and out-of-focusness. It causes us to do and think ridiculous, divisive, sometimes despicable things. The thing is, it's simultaneously true that we are each perfectly unique and that we are all fundamentally the same. These notions might seem to be in conflict, but they're really in perfect harmony. Our goal should be to seek unity and clarity, and that can only happen when we adjust our lenses. I'm not against DEI trainings, not in principle. Diversity is a wonderful thing, so long as it's real and not what the historian Barbara Fields once described as getting together a bunch of people who look alike but think the same. Equity is a wonderful thing when defined, as it should be, as being the quality of being fair and impartial, rather than this idea that racialized groups must have equal outcomes on any given metric. This viewpoint not only oversimplifies complex social, cultural, historical, interpersonal, and structural issues, it also eliminates individuality from the people in question. Inclusion is a wonderful thing, so long as it is truly inclusive of different perspectives, viewpoints, voices, and arguments, rather than exclusion by another name. I want a diverse world. I want an equitable world. I want an inclusive world. There are plenty of issues in our society that need addressing, including issues of racism and intolerance. Bias and bigotry are real problems, and they can sometimes go either unnoticed or unaddressed. There is a role for programs and protocols that call out mistreatment and misunderstandings between coworkers, blind spots in hiring practices, and structural issues that inhibit individual progress. But there are ways that we can do this that are constructive rather than presumptive, resentful, and retributive. It is possible to counter inhumanity with humanity, to respond to dehumanization and demonization by emphasizing the dignity and individuality of each and every human being, no matter what group they belong to. Diversity, equity, and inclusion need not divide, essentialize, and inflame. We can find a better, more human-centered way of tackling these topics. In my view, this better way begins with recognizing the unique individuality of every single human being on Earth, regardless of the identity groups they're forced into and the norms and expectations that are thrust upon them as a result. And this better way ends by simultaneously emphasizing our common humanity and our shared experience as conscious creatures, the core of our very beings, the things that are inextricable from us and fundamental to us because we are human. We are, each of us, interlocking and overlapping circles of identity and individuality, both unique and unified in our differences. We share 99% of our DNA, and yet within that 1%, we are breathtakingly diverse and multifaceted. We are each a singular, inimitable expression of beauty and wonder, children existing within a fraction of an eye blink of history. We are individual waves in one ocean, together but apart, one and a multitude, infinitesimal and infinite. Everyone that I meet is at once a stranger and my own long-lost sibling. I see myself in them and them in me. We are, as Carl Sagan once said, a way for the cosmos to know itself. We are stardust. Every atom in our bodies and in everything we see around us was forged in the heart of a star billions of years ago. We are, as George Carlin once put it, simultaneously greater than, lesser than, and equal to the universe. In a concrete, fundamental way, we are all manifestations of the cosmos, colliding, arguing, disagreeing, fighting, going through all these problems, struggling through progress, finding ways, regressing, then coming back, but also uniting, befriending, loving, and working together to build a better world for ourselves and, by extension, for others. I think it's innate. I think it's compulsive. We want a better world. The vast majority of us agree. Imagine what progress anti-racism might make if it took that concept as its starting point. Imagine how much more we can improve interpersonal and workplace relationships if our DEI programs centered our common humanity, our shared desires as human beings, and our capacity for good, instead of reinforcing and reifying the divisions that caused us so much pain and suffering throughout our history. When I think about that, I really like what I see. Thanks for listening.
Wow. That is incredibly powerful, Angel, and I aspire to your eloquence. On that note, I've got a question about microaggressions, and one of the things that I've heard as a microaggression, and I get fumble around with this myself.
Mm-hmm.
I was given an example the other day of telling someone. It was actually something that you and I were doing together, was of telling John Wood Jr. how inspiring that he was as well. And there's often a microaggression when people say, "Oh, you're so articulate," right? And when I was
Yeah.
doing a training around this one day, I was saying, it really is, the context matters, right? And I gave the example of me speaking with John and me speaking to you today, of saying, just wow. I mean, obviously I just heard something that was so inspiring to me. But when we talk about microaggressions, if someone is constantly hears, "Oh, you're so articulate," the message that I've heard when I've talked to other people, that some people feel that they're getting, is that they shouldn't be, right? Is a
Mm-hmm.
negative, that, like, why would someone who looks a certain way or has more melanin be
Yeah.
articulate? And so,
Right.
I mean, I know that there's some microaggressions, I think, kind of border on the ridiculous, but there are others more like, there's others maybe more like that, where I could see, if I was told that frequently, how that would make me feel less than. So in dealing
Mm-hmm.
with like these, and you said, I think is like, I think you used the example of mosquito bites. I've also heard the
Mm-hmm.
example of what is 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm wondering, are there, I guess the question for you is, are microaggressions real? I mean, some, they might, we might be overblowing them a little bit, but is there such a thing? And where they are real, is there a way that we should address them? I mean, again, I agree with you to the extent that now I'm so scared to say anything that's positive sometimes to someone, or complimentary
Mm-hmm.
to someone, because I'm like, oh God, did I make a mistake? And so in a way where we've taken away that
Yeah.
opportunity to interact authentically.
Mm-hmm.
And yet,
Yeah.
I can see when I hear some stories, particularly the one I'm telling you now about the, you're so articulate, as when I put myself in those shoes, I, I see how I could feel if I
Mm-hmm.
was in that position. So what are your
Mm-hmm.
thoughts around that?
The first thing that came to mind was, I don't know the origins of this, but the thing where you look at your wife and you say, "You look really nice today," and then she goes, "What? I didn't look good yesterday?" That I feel like that's the crux of it, right? There's
Yeah.
You mentioned context. Context matters, right?
Yeah.
So so if your husband is somebody who never compliments you, or constantly says that you don't look nice, then you know that when they said, "Oh, you look nice today," they mean you usually don't, right? And I think that the origins of the "you're so articulate" thing, it, given the origins, it makes sense, right? Because the context was people of a certain skin pigment were not expected to be smart or literate, and as a result, it was a surprise when you encountered one who was, right? And that and the comment was framed in that way. The contextualization of that comment
Mm,
is that environment, right? So it makes sense. The problem is that the context has changed, but our response
mm,
hasn't. It is now absolutely,
right.
unremarkable in a way to encounter somebody who's articulate who happens to be, highly melanated, right?
Mhm,
That's not a surprising thing anymore because there are tons and tons of intelligent, amazing, talented, incredible people who have dark skin. And it's not that surprising, right? Like our culture is dominated by
mhm,
incredibly talented, articulate, eloquent people who are of that, ancestry. So the context has shifted, right? And I think it's wrong, it's mistaken. Almost, I would say it's probably somewhere around like 98%. I would give 2% of wiggle room, but it's probably more, honestly. And I would say 98% of the time, when someone is saying, "Wow, you are so articulate," they mean it sincerely and they don't mean that they're shocked. They just mean they're impressed by you as a person. And I think it's okay to go on that assumption rather than the other one, right? Because the thing about microaggressions is, yeah, I mean, I guess they're real in the sense that people may inadvertently insult you, right? That happens. People inadvertently insult you. They speak the wrong way, or they use a word in a way where to you that word it rings differently, right? Like I remember making a joke with a professor, basically calling him a jerk, right? And to me, that's a really, really mild thing to say, right? In my context, my growing up, calling somebody a jerk was like, "Oh, you jerk." Like it's not anything heavy, right? But he was older than me, and his upbringing and his context, calling somebody a jerk was more intense. And so he was extremely offended, right? And I said, "Oh, well, I didn't mean it in a horrible way like that. I was just kidding around, whatever." And he's like, "Apology accepted," and we moved on, right? Like that's the end of the interaction. It's okay. And I think that the answer to microaggressions, insofar as they exist, insofar as these kind of talking past each other, accidentally bumping into each other verbally, kind of things exist, the response is grace, right? Just go, you could flag it and be like, "Hey, I don't like it when you say that," or "I don't like it when people say that to me because it makes me feel like this." Then with that individual person, you could be like, "Oh, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that," and you clarify and then you move on. This weird thing where not only is it, not only am I going to presume your intentions and then hold you to that presumption, whether you intended something or not, I'm going to say, the way that I respond is based on this particular intention, which I'm going to hold you to no matter what you actually meant, right? That's the thing. People say, intention versus impact, but impact is about perceived intention. That's what people don't realize, right? What you're basically doing is saying, "No, no, no, I get to decide what you intended, and I get to respond based on what I decide, not what you think or what you meant. I get to decide what you meant, and then I get to respond that way." That gets us nowhere. That just creates hostility where there wasn't any, and it's probably a misunderstanding, or maybe there was no microaggression at all. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're overly sensitive. Maybe, whatever. Maybe you speak different languages, right? In England, people call each other cunt all the time. That's just like, "Hey, dude," right? If you don't know that and
mm,
someone from England starts talking to you and calls you that, you go, "Whoa," but
mm,
context, and then you go, "Oh,
mm,
you guys use that in a totally different way. Let me just fill you in. We use it in another way and you might get in trouble," right? There's just, it's grace is the way that we should be approaching this stuff because communication is hard. Getting to know people is hard. Sometimes
mhm,
compliments don't land right. Sometimes compliments are not received the way that they were intended. Like it's a dance that we have to both participate in. And I think that there are a lot of ways in which a negative response, um, a vicious response, a kind of, essentialist response, like, oh, of course you would say that because you belong to this group, and now I've completely dissolved you into this larger group, and I'm holding you responsible for, the history of all that. I just think we're creating fault lines where none should exist and none did exist. It seems to me to be wasted energy.
I just have to repeat a mic drop moment from what you just said. Context has changed, but our response hasn't.
Hmm.
That's
Right.
that's everything right there. And I think that goes to what you're talking about too, is context and individuality are, while not one and the same, very
Hmm.
connected. When you know someone for who they are, you have the context
Right.
for better interpretation. Like the other kind of moment that you were just saying is who decides on the intention, right? Well, when you have the context for who it is, that becomes a little, the intention is almost a shared intention when you
Right.
get to know someone better versus only what you interpret as
Right.
the intention.
Yeah, and it makes sense for something like the articulate compliment, right?
Hmm.
The context was most people who look like this are racist because that's the paradigm we're living in, right? We're in the, you know, 1890s or whatever, however far you want to go back, right? Or however close you want to get. you know, that context makes sense and that assumption would make sense, but we've grown past it and we're still behaving as though we don't, as though we haven't, as though the context is exactly the same. Of course, there are still racist people, but I think it's less likely. It's more likely that you're misunderstanding, that there's some kind of, crossed wires,
Hmm.
you know? And the same thing with like the compliment about you look really nice today, right?
Hmm.
Your husband, and if he compliments you all the time, then he didn't mean you didn't look good yesterday. He just means you look great right now. And that's all he was trying to say. But if he's a jerk and, is constantly criticizing you, then you understand that's a different context. That's
Right.
a different way you should receive that. It's the same thing with the jokes that I would tell and the things that I would say at my job, right? They didn't have the relevant context because they didn't know me very well. So they're just like, this kid is saying crazy things at the office and we can't let him, we have to tell him like there's a problem here, right? Totally understandable. You don't know me and you're not necessarily operating in the same kind of bubble as me where I think certain things are funny. That's okay. We just talk about it, talk it out. I didn't get fired. I didn't get penalized. It was just like, hey, some people read this a different way, et cetera, et cetera. And I go, oh yeah, you're right. Of course I was bummed. I was like, I didn't mean anything, but they don't know that, you know,
Mm.
but at least they asked.
Well, I've got one more question for you that I feel like some of the most pernicious parts of the way some DEI is practiced is exactly what you say. We buy into a group narrative versus an
Hmm.
individual narrative. But here's what my question is for you. Do you believe this is what I see is that we ourselves flatten ourselves. So not only does this group
Oh
narrative
yeah.
flatten us, but we buy into this. I am white, so therefore I do this. I am black, so we actually though we in some ways shed our own individuality. We buy into the narrative and flatten ourselves. And I feel like that is as dangerous as the group
Hmm.
narrative existing in general. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a fish don't know they're wet thing. This is
Mm,
the paradigm that we've been given, right? It's like the Matrix. Like nobody knows they're in the Matrix. They're just walking around. It's the world. And somebody has to come in and tell them, hey, this world is not real. Check it out. Look at the green characters crawling through the screen, right? It's kind of like that. People just go, well, yeah, I am white. And as a result, I have these biases and I have these things because they're just accepting the game. They're accepting the game and the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are if you're white, You have privilege, you have inherent racism that you need to identify, grapple with, repent for, all that kind of stuff. They just buy into that, and it's just I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I do understand it. I was about to say that I don't really understand why someone would willingly do that, but it's kind of a version of Catholic guilt, right? It's kind of a version of the horsehair sweater and like the self-flagellation. Like there's something about it that appeals to a certain kind of people.
Mm,
Not me, but I get it. I do get it because I grew up Catholic, and I grew up kind of like somehow feeling righteous in the sense that I was admitting to my corrupted nature, something
mm,
like, oh, I'm begging forgiveness for being such a wretch, and that makes me feel better. There was something going on there that I couldn't quite understand, right? But I was feeling the thing. And, just thinking about it more, I'm like, this is a little bizarre because that's just a guy. He's not a special guy. He's just a guy. Uh, like George Carlin says, I have as much authority as the Pope. I just don't have as many people who believe it. So I just kind of I went there. But to translate it, I do think, I mean, we've seen videos of, you know, racialized white people literally prostrating themselves, like washing the feet of people of color and bowing and like, begging forgiveness for their racism when they probably said and did nothing, right? They definitely didn't own slaves or anything like that. And they're too young, right? So it's just it's a bizarre thing. But I think there's a lot of something has to be in it for people, right? They have to be getting something out of it. And I think this feeling of absolution, and then this kind of perverse feeling of belonging,
mm,
even though it pits you in this strange dynamic where you're like this hateful person who can't help but be hateful, and you have all these terrible qualities that you're radiating out into the world and making the world a more toxic place just by existing. It's a strange thing, and not everybody thinks like that, obviously, but yeah, I don't know. It's
S-
weird.
Well, you just that this idea belong because everyone, I think, regardless of DEI work,
Hmm.
is looking for belonging. That's just human nature,
Sure.
right? And finding our tribe is human nature. So based on
Hmm.
what you said, and I love this idea is this company cohesion. Yeah, and you
Hmm.
gave one example of having, by onboarding someone, they go and they meet everyone, and that gives again that context and that individuality.
Yeah.
With regards to if there is going to be some sort of a diversity or DEI or what we are just saying D and I training
Hmm.
that focuses on individuality, are there a few things that you would suggest that would be highly effective off the top of your head?
Yeah, well, as you know, I work for FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and we have a diversity program. We have Fair Diversity. So you check out fairdiversity.org, and it's based on rigorous psychological science and also what we call this pro-human approach. This
Mm,
approach that centers the unique individuality of every person and also emphasizes the common humanity that we share, and using that as the bedrock upon which to build or repair relationships, right? Because racism exists, bigotry exists, those things are real, and interpersonal conflicts are real things. Workplaces can be really hard. People have clashing personalities and all sorts of things. So it matters to figure out ways to make things better, right? And I think that it's possible to acknowledge the problems without inadvertently sucking yourself into the problem itself. And I think that part of the reason why DEI programs don't work for me, and they don't seem to work at all. Roland Fryer did a bunch of research, and it turns out that
yeah.
they either make things worse or they don't do anything. Uh, I think the reason is because they don't recognize that they have the problem baked into their solution. And the problem
Mm,
is seeing
mhm,
one another as fundamentally divided from one another based on these characteristics that we cannot change, and also seeing one another as avatars for these you know
mm,
larger groups. Like I get to that's why I talked about representation, because
mhm,
this idea of like I get to decide that I'm a representative of an entire group of people, which is crazy, right? And the same thing for people, racialized as black. And the idea that a dude who lives next door to me, who's racialized black and has lived in New York City his entire life, he likes New York pizza, he goes to the shows, he all that stuff, he has more in common with a racialized black person in Mississippi than he does with me. That's crazy, right? Just because they have the same race, quote unquote race, they're racialized the same, so somehow they belong to some magical group where they have more in common than that guy has with me, even though we've lived next door to each other and we live in the same city, we operate in the same context, we talk the same way. That's just ridiculous, So that's the thing, is the DEI programs that we see usually just take it as a given. Like, there are these different races. They say race is a social construct. Usually they pay lip service to that idea. But once they do, they just double right back. And they basically might as well not have said it, because they behave as though there's something about this social construct that is affecting you almost genetically, right? It's inevitable. You're going to behave, you're going to behave a certain way. You're going to think a certain way. You're going to be a certain way, and you're going to interact a certain way with other people based solely on this social construct that is apparently not real, according to them. They say it's not real, but it's real. It's real as hell. It's doing something real to you, and we need to have this whole program to get you to stop doing all this stuff that is an effect of this not real thing that we're saying is not real. I don't know. It's weird. It's like, but the real solution is to actually abandon those things. We have to actively reject those things. And now that doesn't mean, you and I have talked about this before, but rejecting race does not mean rejecting or ignoring racism. Those are two different things, right? The same way where I'm not a religious person, but I recognize that religion exists and that there are people who are Christian and Muslim and Jewish, and that because of their beliefs, they act in the world in a certain way. And I recognize that historically, the presence of religion has changed the course of history. I know those things are real. My rejection of religious belief as an individual doesn't change any of that. But it also doesn't change how I can engage with that reality, right? I can engage with religious people in a certain way without buying into it. And I can engage with religious fundamentalism or religious extremism in whatever way I need to without accepting any of their premises. I don't have to. It's the same thing.
Well, again, this has been amazing. I have to tell you, I learned one other thing about you as an individual today that surprised me. So I know what a big
Am I
fan.
articulate?
Yes. No, you're so articulate. I mean, that's not it. So, but I know your love of Superman. And when you told me your favorite movie was Pulp Fiction, it kind of took me back, because I was like, well, surely it's Superman. So
That's definitely one of them for sure. That's definitely one of them. It's true. That's probably number two.
Well, I do love Pulp Fiction too, but I was like, I thought it was Superman.
Yeah, definitely it was my favorite movie for a long, long time. But I'm also a writer, and it's just Pulp Fiction is so good. It's just so well written.
Good. It's so good.
Yeah.
But the original Superman, is that the one that is your favorite? Okay.
Yeah, when I was a kid, as long as it was Christopher Reeve as Superman, I would watch it. And the other movies are pretty bad. Like the third and fourth ones are really bad. But there's some great moments in him, and he is always great. So I love that. But yeah, I think if I had to choose, like as a grown man, my favorite movie, it would probably be Pulp Fiction. But Superman from 1978, that's definitely up there. I'm actually going to see it in theaters this weekend. They're re-releasing it in theaters, and I get to watch it for the first time in a movie theater. It's going to be great.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. So it will have already happened when people see this.
Yeah.
What can I say? I contain multitudes. I contain multitudes, Jen.
You're multifaceted for sure, Angel.
I know. Unique individuality.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for spending the time with me.
Thank you. It was awesome.